Welcome back to the masterclass from the European Open Source Academy about building and sustaining open source impact. My name is Amandine Le Pape. I am the head of the Business and Impact section of the European Open Source Academy, and I am walking you through how open source business owners and corporate users can drive the change. We have got to lesson number 5, which is about navigating the corporate buyer's dilemma. We have already been through a bit of background on my side with Matrix and Element, recognizing the opportunity of open source, both the impact it can have and as a business owner. We talked about the foundations that needed to get right for the success of your open source business. We talked about the levers that you could pull to make the business successful, and finding the right business model for you, depending on your circumstances. So navigating the corporate buyer's dilemma. There are different reasons for organizations to actually buy open source. And there is a sticking mental image that says open source is free. Free as in beer, as well as free as freedom. So people basically don't want to pay for it. But open source doesn't magically materializes itself, and all the projects need to have some level of support. Not all the business models are well recognized, and not all contributions are actually equal. So this lesson aims to clarify why and how open source should be financially supported. So why do organizations use open source? There are several potential reasons for this. So the first one, it might be just because it's the best product. Why bother? If this is the best product, which is open source, let's just use it. Open source fosters the innovation. It's easy to build something which is better than proprietary. The flexibility and ability to customize. If the product is out there, then it means I can take it, customize it to my needs, and basically make it fit my specific business case. The speed of innovation, having this common out there with different eyes looking at it means it may evolve faster than if it's just a closed organization working on it. The transparency and the trust. If you are using a product that is very sensitive, then you will be happy to be able to audit it yourselves, as opposed to trust one vendor that their black box is actually without any weakness. Eventually, the ecosystem and the interoperability. You might be able to switch vendor, which is pretty important, not be locked to one specific vendor, be able to add additional services or applications around the one you are already using, or potentially communicate with someone else which uses a different application, etc., etc. The community support and the collaboration. You can see it as free help, but it might also be the core to how an organization may want to use the product, be able to collaborate with others. The lack of vendor lock-in, so the sovereignty you get over your data and the application, how you run the application. And it might also be just because leadership has said you should use open source, like top-down decision, you have to use open source. And eventually cost efficiency, might just be cheaper than buying a license, which is where this lesson comes in. But whilst an organization may be keen to use the open source product, it's a whole different story when it comes to actually support the project or the company building it. So there are several risks. What happens if the open source projects are not supported in a sustainable way? Well, it might be a single contributor actually propping it up, which means that they may just burn out and disappear overnight, leaving the project without any maintainer. The company behind the product may go bankrupt, which same thing, it may be taken over by the community, but then you lose a whole bunch of expertise from that company. So it's very, very much the equivalent of the single contributor burning out, but at a bigger level. There will be no accountability. Basically, you are using a product, but not being accountable for how you use it. The project may be taken over by a non-open source company. So If the company behind the project is actually going under, then someone else may come in with completely different objectives and may drive it in a completely different direction, removing all the open source bits and keeping, like, locking everyone into one big silo. So why does procurement actually struggle with open source? We've seen that some of the business models are pretty well understood. So the support and services, or SaaS, that's something which is easy to sell. And buying support for something, procurement framework has the right boxes to check for this. But some others are a bit more complicated or less common, or doesn't fit the expected shape that procurement may have. And it may be more complicated to understand from organizations who are basically used to buy proprietary software. And the other reason is that maybe it just doesn't match the mental image that open source is free. If it's open, I don't have to pay for it. So let's look at some of the example feedbacks that you may getting against some of the business models. So you may recognize this map, which we used earlier to define and map out the business models we have, depending on what you sell and who you're selling to. So, for example, not going into every single details, but typical pushback may be, I can't use proprietary software. I don't need your help. I don't need your support because this is open, so surely I can deal with it. I cannot use SaaS. Consulting and support is the one which actually is pretty well understood. Some of them are pushing back against the copyleft licenses, and the other option is, like, I can't give on the donation side. I cannot give donation. I don't have a budget line for this. So in short, at best, the procurement team actually understands that software may be propped up by a community, but there is a cost to it. But at worst, the technical buyer is familiar with the model of open source and understand it needs to be supported, but the procurement team looks at open source like as a free service, something which is available to anyone freely, and fails to map the openness with the value. Like, this may be open, but it is value that is being brought, and you may want to pay for it. Basically, they're too used to the obscure value that is provided by closed software providers, where you get the value, but because they hide it, then you have no choice but pay for it. But the good news is that the rules can change, and the teams can be educated. So let's look at a bunch of key facts around open source products. First, they're built by human. Not even in the area of vibe coding, etc., we still need a human to put them together and make them work. So they may do it within their day job or on the side of it. Second, a professional organization relying on open source products needs to make sure that these open source products are not going to disappear, because your functioning or your own products are actually built on top of it. It's basically a risk that you're taking. Contributing code is a bit like giving someone a kitten. It's very generous at first, but the cost of maintenance lasts a lifetime. A user-facing open source product needs a minimum of resources to be able to compete with closed source alternative. Open source user-facing products are infamous for being bad user experience, not pretty, not glossy, and it's much easier and much nicer to turn to a product which works well and is easy to handle, even if it's proprietary. And in the end, when you are building an open source product, you still need a team of a certain size with certain processes to make sure that the product you build is at least at the same level as the ones from the closed software. In terms of how to support the ecosystem, the open source ecosystems can be pretty varied behind an open source project. There may be a community of volunteers who are working in their free time. It may be a foundation who is leading a group of contributors from various players in the ecosystem, which might be a mix of commercial organizations who are contributing to the product, mixed up with some of the volunteers working on their free time, etc. Or it might be a professional organization who is actually leading the development itself. or it might just be a combination of the three. So we need to set up really a bunch of smart buying strategies to ensure the organization's goal is reached, but also fitting in the constraints and supporting the project. So you have an organization and you have a goal to reach. So you need to make sure that you can actually support the project who is helping you and fit your constraints. So how do you do that? If you look at a project which is led by a community of volunteers, their motivation is to have fun. They like the idea of contributing to the project. They are proud of the work they do. For them, it's mostly fun and pride. What can help them? Well, the things which would prevent the project going under would be to add more volunteers and support, maybe some help to corral the projects, potentially additional revenue to make sure that they can continue their work on the project and not being completely taken over by their day job. So some smart buying strategy here would be, for example, a recurring donation to the foundation who is managing this group of volunteers. Or commit some resources to actually support the project. So bring in your own developers to help run the project. If the project is led by a foundation, then the motivation is for them to make sure that the project is sustainable. It's out there, it's alive, it's evolving, and it lasts. So what can you do as an organization who benefit from their project to help them? Well, it probably depends on how the foundation is set up itself. But any case, I think we can say that recurring funding towards the foundation should help unlock already quite a lot. So it will help sustain the management of the project. Maybe the foundation can set up some grants for smaller developers. They may set up some research project, do some marketing around the project to make sure it's used even more. Do some security audits and this sort of things. So I think it's pretty safe to say that if you have an open source project like by a foundation, getting them some recurring revenue will be used properly, like nicely. They will find a way to use it. So the smart buying strategy there would be either a recurring donation or whatever the foundation recommends. So there may be some partnership opportunities or this sort of thing. So you need to work with them. And eventually, if the project is led by a professional organization, then their motivation is both sustainability of the project and the growth of it, like having more users, but they also need to make sure that their own organization is going to be able to stand up. So even like beyond, we need to do lots of profit. Well, we need to at least stay alive is a first step. So if you're using the project, what can you do? You can provide some recurring revenue again, so they can commit a team to improve the project. So the way development organizations work is you have developers, they're paid for either by the revenue of the organization. If the revenue comes in regularly to serve a certain goal, then the team can be committed to this goal. Otherwise, they have to be moved around to serve whatever is bringing most revenue. The smart buying strategy in that case would be to buy the product that the organization is selling, or buy from other organizations who in turn may be buying from this one. So you need to make sure that if you buy a product from someone, they actually support the upstream. And the other option is recurring funding if none of the product makes sense compared to what you are trying to do. So in short, deciding to use open source software is a great way to have an impact on the world. But whatever the maintenance model behind the open source project is, someone needs to help to support it. So they need to support it to make sure it continues to exist and evolve. You need to support it to make sure it stays reliable, and you need to support it to make sure it stays secure. The ones better placed for it are organizations that rely on it professionally. So someone who uses a project just for fun are less incentivized to actually support it. They may just do it because they enjoy it, but organizations who rely their operation or their product on a project should be supporting it to make sure it stays alive. Not all contributions are equal though. Financial support in an easy one. You can be pretty sure that financial support will help any organization, but it needs to be recurring. Code contribution is a bit tricky. because it needs to come with the maintenance support. Otherwise, you're just handing it poisoned chalice a bit. Other in-kind support, maybe free audit or free hosting may work too, if it doesn't bring additional burden to the organization. It needs to be 100% positive.